Afternoon. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon. I'm Coursey, managing partner of TomorrowVentures, and I'm going to be moderating this panel today we've got a great group of people here. And I want to thank first Mike, Margaret, and the whole Faster Cures team and Milken teams. You know, I really think this conference is one of the best around because I think that collectively we're all trying to solve really big problems, and for me that's really exciting, and there's some really amazing people. For our panel today, we're going to be discussing that while there's growth in investment dollars into the biotech space, how that is still flowing into a relatively small number of companies, and what other alternatives and options are out there for funding. So that's kind of the high level. Let me take a minute to introduce our group, and then I'll let them each kind of give you 1 to 2 minutes on why they're here and what's important to them, and then we'll kind of jump into the meat of our session. To my right, we have Lindy Fishburne, who is founder of Breakout Labs and the Thiel Foundation. Next, we have Aron Betru, who is with the Milken Institute. And then to my left, we have Dr. Peter Schultz, CEO of the Scripps Research Institute and president of California Institute for Biomedical Research. And last, we have David Steinberg, executive vice president of PureTech. So I appreciate you all being on this panel and excited for our conversation. So maybe we'll just take a minute, and Aron, we'll start with you and kind of tell us why you're on the panel and why you're here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So, as Court mentioned, my name is Aron Betru. I'm with the Center for Financial Markets at the Milken Institute, which is, across the various centers of excellence that the Milken Institute has, driving essentially doing, evidence-based research to address a particular challenge. With Faster Cures being focused on the medical research front, the Center for Financial Markets looks at it from the lens of products and services in the financial sector and the markets that move them, how we can use those as a tool to address challenges. And so from our perspective, looking at medical research and everything in terms of the gap between treatments and diseases is something that the Milken Institute and our center in particular needs to weigh in on and address.
Lindy?
Hi, I'm Lindy Fishburne. I run a fund called Breakout Labs that operates out of a foundation where we are able to seed fund really early stage hard science, hard tech companies. Often it's the two people rolling out of university that have had a scientific breakthrough. And we came up with a unique financial instrument, basically a convertible grant, that allows us to invest and fund in those companies when there's still technical risk on the table and help grow them up to the point that traditional market rate investors can follow on. So we have a portfolio of 30 companies all across hard science, several in life science, or what we think of as the intersection of technology and biology. And then just earlier this year, we launched Breakout Ventures as a predominantly Series A, Series B fund to allow folks to leverage the pipeline that we build with the nonprofit dollars on the Breakout Labs side.
I'll just give you a quick background on me. I even though I'm moderating, you may hear me pipe in from time to time. I primarily focus on early stage technology companies. We've got over 100 companies in 8 countries and 20 cities around the world. Digital health is a big focus for me. When I was an entrepreneur, I sold one of my first companies to WebMD in December of '98, and ShareCare, which was founded by Jeff Arnold of WebMD, is one of our big focuses in the digital healthcare space.
Pete Schultz. I come here from the nonprofit sector, president of Scripps Research Institute in Caliber. What we're interested in is creating a new model for nonprofit research institutes that not only advances science through basic discovery, but accelerates the translation of those discoveries to new medicines. And really, it's from conception of the idea all the way to human safety or proof of concept studies. So into the clinic is all done within the nonprofit. And then we partner at the stage where we have a clinical stage asset. So we have something far more validated and interesting to the pharmaceutical companies. And we're at a stage in the value inflection curve where you could potentially generate significant resources, which you could then reinvest and nonprofit research and translational research to create an evergreen model that's self-sustaining and solves many of the funding problems we see today in the nonprofit world. And we're at an interesting stage in doing this where we're putting this together not by building from scratch, but by bringing together two institutes, Basic Research Institute, Scripps, and a Translational Research Institute, Caliber, which I happen to be president of both, so it makes it easy to do. And we're at the stage where we have 8 to 10 molecules that are 1 to 2 years from a phase 1 clinical trial. So we've actually developed assets, and we're now looking for the best model to move those assets into the clinic. How do you best fund those to make new medicines for unmet needs, but also to capture the value to create this self-sustaining model? So that's where we're at.
David?
I'm David Steinberg with PureTech, and PureTech is, we consider PureTech to be a new kind of biotechnology company. And there's a couple things that are, multiple things that make us unique, but two of the things I think I want to highlight here quickly stem from the fact that we come from a problem-focused way of developing therapeutics. So that has these two unique aspects that I think are worth discussing here a little bit. Number one is when we look for modalities that we're going to pursue, we're somewhat modality agnostic. So we like small molecules, we like traditional biologics, but we also like novel kind of cell-based therapeutics. For example, we have a CAR T play and we have multiple microbiome plays. And we also are very interested in and have been pursuing very aggressively digital medicine over the past few years, and we'll get more into that in the panel. And the other implication, that kind of problem orientation versus taking a solution and trying to find a place for it orientation, is that we don't necessarily need to look internally for our programs. We're actually working with outside collaborators and outside PIs and investigators to identify what we consider to be the solutions that we're going to take forward and drive forward as development programs. So that means typically our model, we're actually licensing in and partnering with academic labs and academic research institutions. That has some unique kind of funding implications in and of itself for the way PureTech is funded. We're a publicly listed company, but also we've then found a number of creative ways to move these things forward at their early stages, some of which we'll also talk about during the course of this panel.
Terrific. Well, thank you. So to start this off, let's have a quick kind of lightning round just on, in terms of, is funding of life sciences better or worse from an early stage perspective than 5 years ago? And what do you think the biggest obstacle in the space for funding is? Lindy, you want to take it?
I'm the optimist. I actually think it's trending much better in the earlier stages than it was 5 years ago. Part of the impetus for starting Breakout Labs and making the argument for the role of nonprofit dollars funding companies was because there had been such a pullback of capital out of life sciences, out of hard sciences, and enamored with web tech and IT. And I do think that what we're seeing now is, and there's a direct correlation between what we see in life sciences and what's happening in technology in the broader market. And as that appears a bit potentially frothy right now, we're starting to see what you think of as more tech software money that's now saying, we need to look for value, we need to look for things that are substantive and meaningful and potentially undervalued in this market. So I think we're pretty optimistic about more money shifting. That said, it's hard. It's always going to be hard. And until we can systematically de-risk assets, it is hard for non-life science experience dollars to flow into the space.
I agree with you. Aron, what's your thought?
So I would say both ways. It's there in terms of absolute dollars. Yes, I completely agree. There is more that's going into the space, definitely on the early stage. But there's actually within different therapeutic areas, there are huge gaps that are experiencing it, namely the rare disease side of it, and there's a couple others that have not been able to partake in this increased flow. I think the question in terms of what's actually going right, it's not necessarily that we're not getting more dollars in the space and they're not going to this early stage area, but there are then specific constituencies of patients that are not getting the benefit of early stage dollars going to address their therapeutic areas. And that's where I think a lot of the folks in this panel might be able to provide a little bit of guidance, because there's a different range of, it's not just pure investment. There's another bottom line that everybody at this table is looking at.
Absolutely. Pete?
Well, in the nonprofit sector, I think probably the funding's pretty constant, but the number of people who want funding is dramatically increased. So effectively, there are less resources available per investigator. And the question is, how do you divide those resources? Do you focus them on the very best people, or do you make sure everybody has a little bit of the pie? So I think there really are challenges, and unfortunately those challenges are disincentivizing a lot of the young best scientists to go into academic research. It's being made up in part by foundations, HHMI and cystic fibrosis, JDRF and others, but there really is a challenge, and that's why we need to create new models that allow you to sustain your research institutes outside of the conventional modes.
David, your thoughts?
Yeah, I would concur with the rest of the panel that from a quantitative standpoint, the funding has definitely picked up from 5 years ago. One of the big differences, in fact, I think this is relatively new with respect to biotech funding over the last 20 or 30 years, is that even at the early stages now, the commercial models are starting to be more and more important, actually. And so I think, to some extent, echoing some of these points that were made earlier, just having great science at the early stage is not necessarily going to be enough to draw the investment at this point, because significant pricing pressure, reimbursement, things like that now actually have to, as PureTech, we never really spent a lot of time thinking about these things in the past. Now we build them into the very earliest evaluations, brainstorm, et cetera, of the new programs that we're going to pursue. So I think that's kind of a shift in the kinds of things that are going to be funded, and that's an important shift.
That's great. So I know the next question is a little charged, but I've been told that on average it takes a new drug to about 17 years to get approved from start to finish. So my question is, how long do you think it should take? And if approvals were quicker, do you think it would encourage and open up more funding opportunities? Lindy, I know you've got some thoughts on this.
We started to chat about this before, and I think you've got to break it into the development discovery phase, and then the discussion around, okay, once you're at the end of that, what does that approval process and timeline look like? I think where we see the most dramatic improvements and where I'm most optimistic are around the rational development and the tools and the ability to do things like understand tox way earlier in the process, which should be able to shift the cost curve on drug development. And then we're finally spending money once it gets into the clinic in a more rational way. So I'm optimistic about our ability to continue to shrink the development timeline. The approval timeline is another question, and that's where I think what funders are excited about is so much of the work that's happening with disease foundations and the ability to do things like recruit a clinical trial dramatically faster. Huge impact on the cost and the timing of bringing drugs to market. And that's where I think the power of the groups that gather here is directly relevant to the timing and the investment dollars, because the timing's directly relevant to the investment dollars, vice versa. And so I think that the technology advances and the coordination of patients mean that overall timeline should shrink. I'm not sure I know that there's one right number.
But what do you think from an investment perspective? What's your take? Do you think it's less than 10 years? What's your gut?
I mean, if you want therapeutics to align with traditional venture, then it has to be less than 10 years, right? If you want the broad base of venture funds to be able to look, it actually needs to be closer to 7 on the outset. I think that's why traditional venture comes in the later stages, right? By the time that you're on the back end of that 17 now. So the more that timeline can shrink, the greater number of potential investors you open the opportunity up to, because then it aligns with what a traditional venture fund timeline has to be.
Aron, what's your thought?
I think her numbers are actually where my head was landing as well, but with a couple of points. One, we've actually seen cases where there was epidemic on the global health arena where we were able to fast track a solution to being on the table. So there is mechanisms that can be done that actually could move things to that 7 to 10 year window, principally around things that we saw in Ebola in sub-Saharan Africa that were going on. The issue is always going to be when you actually are trying to get it to finally to a patient, there is going to be certain risks if you haven't done all these different steps. And you have the WHO now pushing for certain mandates at certain infectious disease levels to actually be able to get these patients still indemnified from bad medicine, but still the government being able to control and protect its citizens in a meaningful way. So there is this other balancing act. We have to make sure from an investor's perspective and from a science perspective to be able to get good medicine out there, but we also have to be looking at patients and balancing out protecting patients throughout this whole process. So I think with that, is the number 7 to 10 the right one? Perhaps. I think the only way we're going to know is if we actually do put some pressure in shrinking it down from the 17 years that you said. I think that's a given.
Absolutely. Dr. Schultz?
Well, I was involved in, I think the fastest molecule we moved forward at GNF through Novartis was 7 or 8 years, and the fastest molecule that came out of Scripps was 7 or 8 years to approval. But they've taken longer than that, and I think there are two issues that I've seen. It's the decision-making process. People are still really afraid of failure, so they really want to hedge until they make sure they know something's going to work, which just the decision-making process can slow you down by multiple years.
Right.
And then the clinical trial design is also very critical. So if you have a very clear clinical path forward that's even been paved before with a drug that has warts on it, okay, you can move very quickly. But if you're moving into an area where there's really not the clear, clinical endpoints, and then things slow down, and rightfully so. So I think those are the two aspects of the process that I've seen that one could improve and accelerate the timelines.
And what do you think in terms of speeding up the process, in terms of patients opting in? Do you think that helps speed up the process? Do you, in accepting the risk and encourage more innovation? What's your take?
I think that, again, that relates back to the clinical proof of concept, okay, and how do you design the trial, okay? You can go into a large RA trial, or you can go into a trial with 4 patients and do a proof of concept. And recently Novartis did a proof of concept with 4 patients instead of 4,000, okay? Mm-hmm. And once you have that data, it makes it a lot easier to accelerate and invest in the rest of the program because you have a certain amount of validation. So I think that kind of thinking about clinical trial design is really important, and especially important if you want to make drugs in the nonprofit sector where your resources are really constrained.
And based on your experience, you were saying kind of in your best case, 7 to 8 years. Do you feel that's a good standard?
7 to 8 years was pretty fast. When we discovered it was for a cancer, when we discovered the molecule, we made 5 more molecules before we had the preclinical candidate. That moved through IND-enabling studies without a glitch. We weren't quite sure of the indication, but we guessed at one, and so it went about as fast as humanly possible. And it was a drug that was targeting cancer from a developmental perspective, so there was huge interest in Novartis in validating, developmental pathways as a way to treat cancer. So I would say 7 or 8 years is pretty efficient.
Good. David, what's your thought?
I think we all agree that if it were faster, that would be good. Be good not just from an investment standpoint, of course, but from a societal standpoint. I'm not necessarily confident that it's going to get dramatically faster over the near term. It's a very slow-moving process. And I think, if anything, patient safety is becoming more and more of a concern versus less. So there's a kind of a societal effort that needs to take place to get good drugs approved rapidly. I think it goes far beyond just the kind of the funding environment. But within the funding environment, there are things you can think about to kind of mitigate that. So, to Pete's point, number one, de-risking. An investment doesn't necessarily tie to ultimate approval of the drug. In fact, in biotech sector, it almost never does. right? What you're looking for is de-risking type of milestones that can be either significant value step-ups, of course, or potentially an exit by sale to a pharmaceutical company. So, potentially now there's going to be additional repatriation of international money. That phenomenon actually could increase dramatically potentially over the next several years. So one area is thinking about what the value milestones are. That's one way to kind of drive it. Even if the 17 years doesn't change, there's plenty of business models that only require 5, 7, 8 years to hit a major home run. And the second area is the modality, right? So one of the things PureTech is doing, but a lot of other groups are starting to do too, is think about digital tools not just as companions to regular drugs, but actually as the therapeutic themselves. So in that case, in fact, the development path can be just a few years. In many cases, you don't have to do safety stuff, preclinical talks. You don't have to do any of that, really. So you can get human proof of concept in 6 months if you're, if you set your mind on it. And that's with FDA-regulated products. So obviously, that's not going to solve every problem. But for example, in things like cognitive health, that might in fact be a huge, major driver of human health that can be developed in an extremely rapid way. So, a couple ways to think about it.
Well, and while we have you on, David, we were talking, before. Do we think private capital has failed us? There's obviously it's increasing dollars in the biotech space, but still, not as much is needed from an early perspective. But what's your kind of take on?
I don't think it's failed. I think if you look at, and I'm sure someone here remembers the stats. I don't, but a substantial percentage of drugs that have been approved over the last 10 years have come from, originated from biotech. So I think, to the extent that that continues to be successful, that I think proves out the private fundraising model. Does that mean that there are things that should be funded now that aren't getting funded? Of course, but I definitely wouldn't say it's failed.
And what's your take on in terms of looking outside the box in terms of partnerships with non-traditional funders from a private perspective?
Yeah, I think that's been a very powerful tool, incredibly powerful, especially recently. Even for an example, a PureTech company called Vedanta Biosciences, we did a very early, almost like seed stage partnership with Johnson & Johnson before we ultimately did a much larger licensing deal with that company, which is then turned out to be a fantastic partnership for our portfolio company, Vedanta. So, I think one actually very interesting model, which J&J has pioneered, but other pharmaceutical companies are starting to follow suit on now, is this kind of early partnering model where there's seed rounds, there's smaller, not even full-blown technology or platform licenses, but just early kind of dipping toes in the water kind of partnerships, facilities, right, incubators and things like that. And I actually think that the pharma industry is starting to really understand that the lifeblood of their pipeline is going to come from this ecosystem, and is taking more and more steps now to make sure that that ecosystem remains intact. So that's one example.
That's great. Lindy, what's your thought?
Yeah, I would add, I think that we're very excited about what we see the strategics doing. And as pharma acknowledges that the R&D is coming off their books and they're looking externally for that innovation, it's still not necessarily super efficient, right, to find that matchmaker and find those partners. But you see a lot of models and a lot of opportunities there to have those early engagements, and I think that's good. I also think I'm hesitant to go down the path of saying, investing has failed, as much as I think we now are building a more rational continuum of the spectrum of acknowledging what's philanthropy, what's high risk, where should philanthropy be, because the dollars can be there and maybe the passion's there, and it's rational using those dollars to take greater technical risk, down to, okay, impact investing, and maybe it's a little more technical risk, but we really are looking and hoping for the return, to actual investing, which is not driven by philanthropy and not driven by passion, but fundamentally somebody owes somebody else a return, and so they have to make different decisions, and you need to have, be at the appropriate place from a technical de-risking. And I think the new models that are springing up that so many people here are part of means that you've got different options along that continuum now in a way that's more exciting and dynamic than just saying, on the one end we have pure philanthropy, on the other, we have market rate investing.
So you're saying more of a bifurcated approach in terms of, a philanthropy early on, but potential follow-on rights from an investment perspective?
Yeah, I think it's much more blended, and I think you continue to see philanthropy or impact dollars, and we can argue all day about the words, right? We don't need to do that, but being more creative. And so for us, right, being a foundation that actually invests in companies because you need the company to actually take the advance forward, and that's the best form to commercialize. That's really different than foundations only looking at investing in the basic research. And so I think that blending of new models is, means across that continuum of de-risking, there's now at least several options of types of players to engage with.
I like that a lot. Aron, any thoughts on that?
I guess from my perspective, I think the examples that we just heard somehow signals that there was a problem in terms of when you look at purely commercial investors that were out there. By all means, they were looking at things from a return on invested capital perspective that had a much larger commercial return, and that meant that things were going later and later in terms of when to invest, stage 3 and so forth. Now, the question will always be, when things are that hyper-focused, where are the true novel compounds going to come from? You need to go much earlier in the process, and to your point, absolutely this blended risk approach of whether it be impact investing or philanthropy coming in. I actually think it's a non-question. The reason we have these various models is because when you have a fund that is purely commercial, it has to be commercial. And so the question of whether or not it's failed or not, it's the existence of impact investing, the existence of venture philanthropy is to address it. We're already living that. I think we just have to accept it and call on some of the other stakeholders, whether they be venture philanthropy or impact investing, to look at things even slightly earlier in the process and find things that are really more of the cures. Because at the end of the day, we do have what, as Margaret often says, and every time I see an email, 10,000 known diseases and 500 treatments that address them. That is a reality that we have. So by that definition, we do need to have these other risk-weighted investments that are looking to do things. Otherwise, why are we here?
In having, do you think, more tech-savvy investors, younger investors, do you think that's a help? Do you think that's an area that should be targeted? People that, may have a more appetite for more risk from an early perspective because they realize kind of the double bottom line.
I would think so. I think we're definitely in a realm of millennials that are investors that actually do recognize from the very beginning this slightly different approach to investing than what was perhaps the generation before. So yes, you're going to see more of that, and we are seeing that. And we now gotten better at perhaps naming it, whether it's impact investing. I firmly believe that impact investing has been around much longer than the name itself. Right. It's just now people have been able to codify it and say, I want something more with my investments that does not harm. And that's fine. If it invites more folks to pay attention that their investment should not do more harm, by all means, I'm for it.
Absolutely. So Dr. Schultz, kind of changing the subject, with the changing ecosystem, do we think that it's, more room for nonprofits and academia to participate?
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of folks in academic centers have tried to build drug discovery enterprises within an existing academic institution, but it's pretty hard to do. There are big cultural differences. There are big differences in the way you do science. We're actually trying to do it by taking an existing basic research institute, Scripps, and one that was built to do drug discovery and simply integrating them. And I think by doing that, you can actually come up like a square wave and show that you really can make drugs in the non-for-profit sector that you can actually validate in the clinic. So, all the way from the point of conception what is an unmet need, whether it's an orphan disease, whether it's a neglected disease, or whether it's osteoarthritis, okay, which I have, so we're working on it. And how far can you take it? So, I had about $1 billion education and building tools to do this and learning how to do it with Novartis. And I think all of these technologies that we've built allow you to begin to do this in the nonprofit sector because the cost of doing experiments is dramatically decreased, okay? And the speed with which you can do them is dramatically accelerated. So, pharma takes a bet. If there are 5 ways to tackle a disease, they debate which one of the 5 should we do. With these tools, you can actually do all 5 in the nonprofit sector and start to see which one works. And so that's the approach we've taken. And, we're within 3 or 4 years, we actually are just finishing IND-enabling studies for a molecule that induces chondrogenesis in your knee, so it makes new cartilage. So it's going to be moved into the clinic next year, okay? So it would be the first disease-modifying therapy for OA. We've done the same thing with MS. We have a drug that induces oligodendrocyte formation, so it remyelinates. So it's regenerative medicine, okay? But we have a very interesting novel bispecific for drug-resistant metastatic prostate cancer that in patient-derived preclinical models ablates metastatic prostate cancer. We have a CAR T cell therapy that I think solves the safety issues. So we've developed, we have a whole panel of antifibrotics we're going to put in the clinic next year. And as I said, we're putting in a molecule in the clinic in collaboration with pharma for chronic heart failure. So we have about 8 molecules, and we've made them in about 3 or 4 years. And we've built a clinical team that's doing this. And interestingly, the foundation support has funded all of these early stage studies, from Wellcome Trust for our cancer programs, from CIRM for our regenerative medicine programs, JDRF for some of our diabetes programs. Now the question is, now that we have we're lucky to have really 8 clinical assets, excluding the Gates molecules, how do you move these into the clinic? Because foundations will fund preclinical studies and they'll participate in clinical studies, okay? But how do you begin to put a fund together? And my guess is a $150 million fund could fund a basket of 8 assets into the clinic, at least through phase 1, and in some cases to POC. We'd be delighted as a nonprofit to raise that fund as a catalyst fund, give the money back to the investors, and even give the money back with interest. Because if we're successful in 2 of the 8, well, the things we're developing would probably be partnered for, hundreds of millions of dollars to even billions of dollars, okay? You could easily give the money back. You could give interest on the money back. But then all of a sudden it's become self-sustaining because you can use the excess monies to do the whole thing all over again. So we're right at the stage where luckily we've built the asset pool. We actually have the clinical team assembled. We have clinical trial designs in place. And the question now is, what model do you use to fund this? And our interest is to make new medicines. So people who fund this actually create new medicines for unmet needs, which is what philanthropy is really interested in. But they can potentially get their money back and reinvest it in other new medicines, and we can actually generate enough revenues rather than going to the venture firms. We reinvest it in the whole enterprise, and it goes on forever. So that's kind of where we're at, and that's what we're struggling with, is we have the assets and how best to move them forward now.
Yeah, no, and I've talked with a couple of groups even about a double bottom line, nonprofit in terms of being able to donate to fund, early stage biotech, but then having the returns be able to be further designated based on the return to a second nonprofit, which is, I think, a very interesting concept.
So kind of the beauty of where we're at right now is it's not a prostate cancer drug or a drug for MS. It's a bundle of 8 drugs for a range of different diseases, from cancer to infectious disease to autoimmune disease. So even if your disease, that POC doesn't work, 2 or 3 in the bundle will.
Right.
So the strategy will work, and you'll be part of enabling another drug for an unmet need. So by doing it as a bundle, you also mitigate the risk associated with any given asset. So that's how we're thinking about it, and what we're talking to people here about is what's the best model to do that.
Absolutely. Well, David and Lindy, a question to both of you. One of the things that I found interesting as I've been talking to various people at Faster Cures yesterday and today is the disconnect, and sometimes how developed people that have early stage companies are unsure of how to target investors. And what I know from my perspective with the types of companies we typically invest in, there's so many tools and great opportunities to marry up angel investors with promising technologies. What do you think we could do to better that from a biotech perspective?
I can start. Yeah, so I mean, in terms of connecting investors with entrepreneurs.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's amazing about being in the kind of the Boston, Cambridge ecosystem is that these, it's kind of a high pressure from when I say pressure, I mean from a chemistry standpoint, lots of reactions happening, lots of molecules bouncing off each other, lots of people seeing each other, entrepreneurs bumping into venture, bumping into scientists, bumping into pharma, bumping into philanthropic organizations, et cetera. So part of it is critical mass. I mean, I hate to say this, but a lot of it is where you are. I think there's huge value. I go to networking sessions and scientific presentations, panels, and there's always entrepreneurs there, and just, people are constantly getting introduced just by being in the same location and kind of having those interactions. I think from a funding standpoint, if you're an entrepreneur, especially with a scientific background, I mean, the two most important things are the credibility of the science, which means the scientific team that you assemble. And if you have that team and really credible people on your team, then investors are going to listen to you. They might, again, the commercial thing might come back and end up being a concern, but you always get a discussion if you have the credible scientific firepower on your team. And then, from a more tactical standpoint, it's just about coming to sessions like this, networking, trying to get that warm kind of, introduction, that warm connection, so that the person has a reason to interact. And start small, get a seed. Think about a seed round. Think about we talked about value milestones before. Think about what your value milestones are. Hopefully you can think about something that's fairly circumscribed and will deliver substantial value, and then, start having conversations. Once you get to be the CEO of caliber, then you ask for 150 million. But, if you're a budding new entrepreneur, then you ask for 150,000, and that's how you start the conversation. So,
Lindy, what's your take?
Yeah, I think the limiting factor in some ways is that, not every scientist is an entrepreneur or should be an entrepreneur. I think that there's a great group of scientists as entrepreneur that now are coming out of university. They never intended to stay in university forever, and they've got that savvy, and they will present as an investable team, right? Assuming that the science is there. But I think often you have basically what we would see as stranded science, in the sense that maybe it's the absolute brilliant next breakthrough, it's the right molecule, but it's not attached to a team that's ever going to be fundable from an investor perspective. And that's why the advent of new models that can bundle assets that aren't dependent on the entrepreneur, I think is really important. Accelerator Corp, right, that'll take a bunch of assets and advance those in a rational way, versus thinking that every asset or every molecule needs to be its own startup. I don't think that works, and there's too many costs associated with it. And so when we're looking at funding, we're looking not only at the quality of the scientific breakthrough and how big an idea it is, but also, is it attached with a team that is investable at least through an A and a B? and that shrinks the pool pretty considerably. And so there's a number of folks that want to see and passionately want to see their science move forward. And, as a society, we want them to also, but I think it's about, we need more rational thought at the beginning around what should be a company and what is investable versus what is an asset and the asset should be advanced. And there are two different paths there. And I think sometimes we're in the vein of, everybody should be an entrepreneur, and I'm not sure that actually is doing anybody the right service.
No, I'd say, helping these entrepreneurs, helping these scientists marry up with the right, team to take it to the next level. I just look at it as, what you're doing at Breakout Labs is so cutting edge, in my opinion, and is just very different than, what you see in the biotech space versus in more traditional tech. There are hundreds of incubators and accelerators that help bridge that gap, and there just aren't that many like Breakout Labs. And part of that's obviously, not only your great expertise, but you've got a great partner and, Peter, that helps, think outside the box.
Well, and we do look at it around the quality of the entrepreneur in addition to the quality of the science. And I think that, more to your point, mirrors traditional investing, right? That everybody would always say it's about the entrepreneur. But I think in biotech, what we're seeing is more better, higher quality entrepreneurs that are trying to commercialize, not just stay in research. And then also these other models that allow you to separate the scientist from the science at a certain point so that it can move forward efficiently. And, we probably need more of both, but a balance there seems about right in the market. But then I agree with David on all the other points of getting that entrepreneur out there and connected. Location obviously makes things easier. Part of why we fund nationally is that we do back companies in, Miami and Philly and Chicago and places that may not be in Wisconsin, may not have the same type of venture hubs and communities, but we're able to shine a light on those folks and help take them to those other cities so they look more investable. And so for the folks that aren't on the coast and in the major hubs, I think they're going to have to be the ones that get on a plane and go and make those connections, because traditional investors, they don't like to go to board meetings that they have to travel to too much.
Yeah, just to jump in on this point, actually, I think it's probably one of the most important ones, that this is a real world example of right sizing what you do with a particular opportunity and not leading with the shiny solution right from the beginning. And the reason why I say that is I think we often hear, whether it be XYZ model to find the next breakthrough, that's the thing that's going to work every single time. That's not really the case. The financing is actually a tool to achieve something. And so whether it be in terms of the human capital coming in at the right time that needed to be right sized based on that a particular opportunity, financing is exactly the same thing. So what is the actual holdup? Is it the fact that there's risk on the table, so you need to find something that de-risks it, or is actually not enough capital at the table and you need to have capital injection come? Those are all different methods, and finance can be contorted in a way to actually solve a problem, but start out with actually what is it going to take to get this thing moving to an actual solution on the back end, and then whatever you do is second, not leading with that.
And what do you think government's role should be in,
So-
in tackling this?
So so let me Mirandize myself and say, the Milken Institute is a nonpartisan institution, but there's some interesting points to that question, because at the end of the day, we have private sector on the table, we have venture philanthropy on the table, a research organization, but there is another stakeholder that actually has some risk or some gain to be had in these conversations, and that is government. And there's some interesting things that have been going on. If we look north to our northern neighbor, there's this application of something called flow-through shares, which is basically an institution that has a heavy amount of CapEx expenditures on an annual basis before they get to some sort of balloon later on, and they can create a share in Canada that actually gets sold off to their investors so they can get a tax deduction out of it. And yes, there's other examples of this in the U.S. Maryland's biotech tax credits, but I haven't seen too many examples of that flow-through share being applied. It's principally in the natural resources space, mining, extractive industries, but there is some nice parallels to that. Longer lead time, huge amount of investment up front, and structuring something like that in biotech would be an interesting thing. There's also the other side of it in terms of government leveraging government guarantees. Now, actually, in my former life, I used to run a guarantee fund where when multilaterals would make pledges to developing countries, there was a huge time gap between a pledge and money showing up. And so this guarantee fund, what it would do is place essentially an agreement that if this donor did not disperse to XYZ country for the purchase of malaria bed nets or reproductive health commodities, we'd place this guarantee and open up lines of credit so they could buy immediately. And that was originally backstopped by Gates Foundation, and the US government came on board. And if I remember the math correctly, that was a $300,000 investment from the global health team at USAID that became basically an upfront insurance premium that turned on a $25 million guarantee by Treasury that was then matched by the Swedish government and then some private sector players. So $300,000 created a $100 million guarantee fund. That's some interesting leverage. And there's an example right now being debated on the Hill with Representative Vargas's team. So they've introduced the creation of a translational corporation within the federal government where it would issue essentially bonds that are backed by Treasury that would provide a lot of these mega fund investments. Now, those are two random examples.
And what do you think about the government owning equity?
That's a perfect segue to what a lot of people believe as a red line, that government can never do that. We've seen actually some really good examples of that happening, and I think one example is in Israel with the Israeli Bio-Life Sciences Fund, where they literally provided 50% of the capital for that vehicle as a limited partner, and another entity is actually the GP, and they're having some great activity going on in finding assets or the corporations, the newcos, and bringing it forward. I'm sure some of you would say, okay, that's Canada and that's Israel, but this would never work in the US. I actually say it is working in the US. So, by show of hands, how many of you have ever heard of the organization In-Q-Tel? Okay, there's a few. For the few that are informed, for the rest of us, when I came upon these examples, I was rather surprised. So here's an organization that actually serves the intelligence community. So the intelligence community identified essentially the industrial military complex was not going to be where the DoD was able to find intelligence and other security-laden new tech, that they needed to go to Silicon Valley. Now, there's no way for DoD to find these new codes that are coming out, new technologies that are coming out of Silicon Valley. So what do? They created a nonprofit, and they created essentially a coalition of intelligence and security individuals that created a contract with this nonprofit and funding it. This entity, In-Q-Tel, actually makes venture investments, does co-investing with a bunch of private sector players, and finds things. And this has been going on for nearly 2 decades now. So there is examples of government actually stepping in, making equity investments, and doing it in a meaningful way. However, that really is not to say that it should always happen in every sector, but there are opportunities out there, and figuring out at the end of the day whether or not we are talking about de-risking what is to bring more private capital to the table or just more dollars to the table. We need to start out with what's actually stopping us from solving Margaret's 510,000 gap.
Right. And Dr. Go ahead, Lindy.
Oh, no, I would just say the interesting, when you look at how the money flows, right? If you've got all this government funding flowing into basic research labs at universities, that then the good part is, a nice part of it becomes patentable IP that then rolls out into companies that pays the university. And often they're now taking an equity share that, even though it's not directly on the government books, they're basically funding all of our universities becoming shareholders in companies that the government funded.
Yes.
So there's something interesting going on there, and maybe in a really, in a good way. But the percentage of basic research funding, there's a percentage of that, and it varies based on the organization, that goes into the SBIR and STTR grants, which are really the first grants that are eligible for companies that are often leveraging what's happened on a basic research structure in the lab. And we see, so for the Breakout Labs companies, they're getting those SBRs like 40% of the time. And that's critical early dollars that not only help with that early funding to de-risk, but also a show to the market that someone else has come along and again validated that technology. And those programs are being run, I would say, with more and more an eye to not only looking at the science, but looking at the savvy of the entrepreneur. So making that additional bet on, is this actually a team that can take it forward from an investment perspective, from a company perspective? And that, we'd like to see that increase and the percentage of the bucket that goes into those SBIRs continue to grow.
Absolutely. And Dr. Schultz, just to go back to you for a second, from an academia perspective, what do you think in terms of helping bridge the gap between founders and scientists and early stage funders? What tools would be helpful from that perspective? And
I think like you say, a lot of the funding goes to people with really good track records, okay, and clever ideas. But I think from an organizational perspective, Lindy's right that academic institutions do get equity and they can even share on the royalties, but it's a very, very, very small percentage because in general, IP is taken out of academic institutions at a very early stage, which means there's more risk associated with it, okay, but there's less return to the academic institution. So I think if you can move things further along internally without going to investors, so non-dilutively, okay, then both pharma and biotech investors will be able to evaluate the opportunities far better, okay, in terms of the risk versus reward and the amount of time and money it'll take to get to a real inflection point. And that's what we like to do. So I think that'll benefit everybody, okay, including the institutions because they'll partner at a later stage and get more assets, more of a percentage of the asset value. The beauty there is you reinvest it in basic research and translational research. And again, you begin to get, beyond this challenge of federally funded research, which is becoming a real problem. I mean, historically, that's what NIH has done best. But the resources are really shrinking, and the number of really terrific young scientists going into academics is shrinking too. So you really need to overcome this kind of problem with the funding cycle and certainly the perception of funding early stage research.
So, David?
Yeah, just on that point, on the academic side, there's another interesting phenomenon which is picking up a lot of steam lately, which is academic institutions themselves creating investment vehicles for technologies that emerge from their organizations. So, recent examples, Partners Healthcare, which is, the medical system in Boston has now, I believe, $150 million Partners Venture Fund, which they invest primarily in companies coming out of Partners system. MIT just announced a fund. I don't think it's closed yet, but they'll be raising a substantial fund. I think it was, again, a triple-digit million fund just to fund MIT technologies. There's the Blavatnik Accelerator Fund at Harvard. There's OSI in funding things out of the UK, out of Oxford, which is, I think, $400 million. So,
And UC just launched one too.
yeah, I mean, these are popping up all over the place. So there's now hundreds of millions. It's probably starting to hit into the billions of dollars of. I mean, I'm actually on the advisory committee of the Chicago Tech Advisory Fund, which is a smaller fund. It started out just bootstrap, but now it's a dedicated fund to fund technologies coming out of the University of Chicago. So these things are picking up steam, and I think that as universities make a more and more concerted effort to shine the light on the more interesting kind of technologies and assets that are emerging from within their own ranks, I think this will become more and more important of a vehicle because all these institutions are creating tremendous innovation and tremendous fodder for new companies, and who has a greater interest in seeing those succeed than the institutions themselves?
There's a change. I mean, in a former life, I founded 7 biotech companies and high-tech companies. And each time you do that, in the very early days, the first one I did was with Alex Zaffaroni. It was a platform company that wanted to create a platform so that you can make multiple drugs. As we move forward now, you set up a company to make a drug. That drug is acquired by pharma, okay, and the company's gone, okay? So every time you want to make a new drug in a new company, you have to set up all of the infrastructure all over again, okay? So every time you set up a biotech company, you're copying a lot of the pieces somebody else just set up, okay? And it's a waste of money and time. So I think, again, if you can localize those resources in one entity, okay, whether it's an incubator, we're trying to do it within an academic center, and I think we're doing it pretty successfully. All of a sudden, you don't have to do that every time you want to make a new drug. You have all of the assets, the know-how, the clinical teams, or access to the clinical teams in-house, and you can CRO what you don't have.
And I think that's so smart because it's, you've got such brilliant minds that somehow don't understand how you take it to the next level and how you, put a team in place, raise the capital, and it's that education piece on,
So when I was running GNF, I had a graduate student, a postdoc in my lab, who actually made the molecule that made it to a human pox study for cord blood transplants, okay? One person with a little bit of help, okay? So if you put in the infrastructure and the expertise and somebody in this lab or that lab or that lab can access it, then all of a sudden you can move things along without the huge investments at the early stage and the risk. And so I think that's part of the model we're trying to create.
Absolutely. Well, we've got such a great panel here. Why don't we open it up to questions from all of you, and more than happy to answer. Who has a question? I think we have a mic too. Let's see. No one with a question for this group. Wow.
Quiet
I'll
after
ask a
lunch
question.
crowd
Okay,
here.
Go for it.
So I do believe you're both right that there's quite a lot of new funds that are coming out of universities. Do you think we'll end up seeing a shift more to earlier stage, or do you think that still that drive to find a commercial return will keep it migrated towards later stage? Where do we see the evolution?
I mean, I definitely think it's going to migrate earlier stage. What you're seeing is that these funding groups are working hand in hand with the technology, tech transfer, tech licensing, they all call it something slightly different, but working hand in hand with those tech licensing groups, which, by the way, are getting much, much more sophisticated.
Right.
And we've been doing this at PureTech for 10 years plus, and the sophistication level of the technology license groups has also increased dramatically. And so now working in partnership with those funder groups, I think that actually is a very powerful force. I mean, you see, Merck put $20 million directly into a technology directly out of Harvard earlier this year. A deal like that would have been unprecedented. I mean, it still is unprecedented after that, but you're going to start seeing, I think, more and more things like that over the coming years as these groups start getting more sophisticated and start working together. So.
And what do you think the landscape looks like in 3 to 5 years from now in terms of funding? Do you think there's more in the space?
I think the one thing we haven't
quo?
talked about yet is this kind of idea of convergence, right? So all different entrants now into the healthcare and even to the biotechnology space. So you have, obviously, the Googles and the IBMs, the Apples of the world, but, Uber's looking at healthcare, chip makers are looking at healthcare, everybody is really looking at healthcare. So just from personal experience at PureTech, we've already started to do partnering deals with completely non-healthcare companies to fund healthcare programs. I think you're actually going to see this convergence phenomenon take off. It's 3, 5, 7 years. I don't know exactly what the time frame is, but there's so much vested interest in society in cracking some of these problems we have with healthcare becoming just so unbelievably expensive to the point where we literally can't really afford it anymore, that I think you're going to see all kinds of creative new ways of getting this stuff funded over the next 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, I think everything's going in a positive direction because we're learning more and more biology, okay, and the molecular basis of diseases. The tools are getting far better. I think one of the challenges is for basic research, and I'm a chemist, okay? Basic researchers who want to have an impact on medicine start out with their research and they go forward. But if you start out with your research and you make a terrific discovery and you're going forward, you may not best understand the clinical need or the best way to prove the impact of a potential drug on the clinical need. So I think this ability to connect the clinicians, okay, and what the need is, and how do you differentiate what you're doing versus the rest of the world with the earlier stage researchers is really important to facilitate, the translation of basic research to new medicines. And I think we still don't do that very well, okay? And there have to be better mechanisms for doing that to accelerate the process and make sure what you're working on is really the best way to get to where you want to go.
Absolutely. Lindy, what's your take?
I'll jump in. There's two
Oh.
two questions.
Oh, yeah, okay.
Then I can come, or three, and we can come back to that.
Great, go for it. Oh, go for you can go further front. We'll go.
Do we have mics or?
Okay. We'll start at the back, and then I guess and move.
So, hi, I'm Michael Saugaller. I'm from the National Institutes of Health. So I agree that in order for technologies from research institutes and other types of nonprofits to be more attractive to alliance activity, they need to be, as much as possible, a little bit further down the product development continuum. And despite some of the restrictions that we have, we're working on efforts to do that with our scientists. So the question I have is for research institutes and academic centers outside of the major hubs. Do you have ideas about how they can, where they can look for the needed expertise to help them with some of the product development, so to speak, that could help focus their earlier stage research in a more informed way to get to value inflection points so that one of your ventures or spin out activities would be facilitated?
It's a great question. There's a huge opportunity there. I tend to encourage, our applicants and the companies we end up funding that are in that space, right, to get out of the lab and talk to the real world more often. And so more interactions earlier with potential acquirers, with strategic partners, with the disease foundations that know those patients and know that patient population, right? Whoever their potential audience is, you would be surprised how they're loath to go do the thing that's uncomfortable, right? It's more comfortable to stay in the lab and stay with the science, but the interaction that needs to happen is actually out and interacting with those different groups, and that's the kind of thing that programs or funding can help facilitate or can help require. And so some of the types of things that we see on the grant applications now where, these early stage companies or even, backing into researchers that have to talk about the potential commercial application or their potential commercial appetite or who those, even just start by identifying who are the players they should be talking to. I think those are interactions that don't take a lot of money, but time and attention to that, circling through the system earlier, would be a huge start.
And finding mentors and advisors of people that have done it before. I mean, it's the same thing with, early stage tech, that it's finding someone that's been there and done it before. They obviously don't have to be in your same geographic location, but someone that will invest the time that'll help give you a roadmap.
Yeah, so we're working closely with the Gates Foundation, JDRF, and other foundations, and what they do really effectively is they link people with a very interesting opportunity up with us. So great science, really great opportunity. They don't have all of the infrastructure. Why don't you collaborate? Why don't you fund the collaboration? So you don't have to set up a lot of academic centers or academic expertise in each place. You can begin to consolidate it. And what I've seen with those foundations is they're really great at networking, looking for interesting things, and then bringing together people with complementary skill sets and resources. And I think that's one thing the foundations we're working with do incredibly well.
Yeah, another, just on that point, I think you've seen a number of schools and institutions, of course, face this conundrum, and I've seen people tackle it in a lot of different ways, some more successful than others. But one of the more successful ways is to bring in an entrepreneur, basically hire an entrepreneur to take on that task, that exact task that you're talking about, as an entrepreneur would. So not from someone who was raised in the academic world their whole lives, because there's plenty of those people and you have that expertise. But find an entrepreneur who's done it successfully, bring that person in to help take a new look at the portfolio at that institution. What's the expertise? What's the specialization? What can we really kind of sell our story around that we do better than anybody else in the world? And then how do I communicate that to the rest of the world? And I've seen this actually be very successful at a number of research institutions. So instead of, it's going to be very difficult to do exactly what MIT does or do exactly what UCSF does. But to say we're the best at this one thing and let's share that with the world, I think is possible. And there are definitely institutions that have done that.
John? Oh, sorry. Okay.
Oh, hi.
Great.
I'm Ginger Spitzer from the Foundation for Sarcoidosis Research, and I'm going to ask you to please forgive the elementary nature of this question, but how would you guide or advise a very small nonprofit, almost at a grassroots level, with some capital but limited capital, and yet some ability to do this networking, to bring projects that we've been introduced to in early science to venture philanthropists who might be interested in it? How do we make those connections when we don't have maybe the gravitas of the larger foundations to do that?
Come to this meeting.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll take that. I mean, I think that it's, again, as David said, coming to this meeting, it's explaining the companies that you have access to and the things that are being developed and why it's interesting. It's, I think that it's less about the dollar amount in are you trying to tackle a big important idea, and I mean that's how we look at the world for all different types of investments. So I take it the same for biotech as well. But Lindy, do you have a take on that?
I mean, I think it's the perennial challenge that family offices are probably where you need to find, those bedfellows, and yet they don't put up a flag, right? And so there's not a systematic way that family offices say, hey, we like cancer, we care about this, right? Which would make it so rational. We deal with this with our startups that, have these haphazard stories of you sat next to the person on the plane, and that opened up the opportunity that foundation, family office deeply cared about this disease. And you're like, that's so not a system, right? So we have yet to tap some fabulous way of systematically understanding what family offices care about. They tend to be secretive and talk to each other. And so it is somewhat haphazard, which is not a great answer. But it is about proximity, and there are a couple different gatherings, definitely here and others, that are trying to help those family offices start to put their word out there and make those matchups. But I feel your pain.
And warm introductions are really important, because I
only
can
way
tell
that
you
it works
cold
in that
introductions do not work. So.
Just to add on that point, so one of the centers of excellence within the Milken Institute is a Center for Strategic Philanthropy that actually works with a lot of the different family offices. And so not to say that they will always be a matchmaker, but they actually have a pulse of who actually cares about what. And one of the value propositions that they offer to those family offices, given what they care about, how to find that niche area where perhaps private capital, public capital has already gone in, but there's this niche area that perhaps is being underfunded, and to make sure that their dollars actually catalyze a much bigger impact. And so I would say, and I'm sure there's somebody here from CSP in the room. If not, definitely give me your card and I'll provide that introduction.
Thank you very much. My name is John Graham. I'm a financial analyst, and I write a column at Forbes. And you started the panel talking about the 16 years to go from bench to bedside. And I know the panel has expertise in digital health. And you mentioned IBM and Google, and I know Flatiron's talking on another panel. So would any of you care to hazard whether these new technologies are getting applied to the R&D process? Will they have a dramatic effect on compressing the time and capital requirements to get new therapies out there?
I believe so. I'll take that. Again, we have, as I mentioned, an investment in a company called ShareCare, which was founded by a guy named Jeff Arnold, who founded WebMD. And one of the things that ShareCare does is working with a number of insurers and hospital systems and pharmaceutical companies across the board. And I think that, you know, the goal is that it does become more efficient across the board, and, you know, is a better experience all the way around.
I would just add to that, I think that, and again, I'm not sure what's falling under digital health, but often sometimes that means more of sort of the consumer wearable side of things, or, you know, electronic medical records. I actually think what you're seeing is now we're taking biology and we're leveraging AI and big data and VR and all of those greater tools of computation. And that's presenting a whole new host of opportunities, whether it's that we've got greater visualization to understand the impact of a drug before we take it into humans, so we're making better choices on when you place that clinical bet, or we're able to do better diagnostics so that our clinical trials can actually be dramatically smaller, and you really start to see precision medicine versus trying, you know, our classic clinical trial that was you need a little bit of everybody, so it works for everybody. This isn't Advil, right? So now we're going to get down to using all of our tools of technology to shrink that clinical trial to be the drug that works for that patient population. That's a huge change on the time and the cost curve.
I think we have to,
go ahead.
I was going to say, I just think we have to be careful because, you know, as recent events have shown, just because you have a lot of data doesn't mean you can really figure anything out or predict anything. And think about the amount of data we have with, for example, with genetic profiling now. We have, I saw a tweet storm the other day, and I can't remember who it was, so I apologize for not citing the person. But if you have, just think of two equations you learned in algebra, you know, in high school. You know, x plus y equals a and 2x plus y equals b. You substitute and you figure it out. Now, what if you have 10,000 equations and you don't have all the equivalencies on the other side? That's what your genetic profile is, right? Obviously, I'm oversimplifying, but in order to figure out how to make good use of all this data, I don't think we should be thinking about shaving years off of drug development right now. I think we should be thinking about making better decisions. And eventually, in the future, maybe we'll figure out how to actually shave years off too, but I think it's premature to say that we're going to shave years off.
I think all of these new tools can teach us a lot more about the effects of a drug early on and predict its efficacy, but you're also going to learn a lot more about the potential liabilities of a drug very early on. And so there's going to be, you know, pluses and minuses that all of a sudden you'll learn about potential side effects very early on in the trial that may or may not.
Absolutely, and I think going back to the core thesis of this panel is your point. I think the success in digital health will ultimately potentially provide funding for some of these biotech companies as well, and really have a complete life cycle. And so I think that's pretty exciting.
It's not on.
It's not on.
Oh, there you go. Nora Yan, NCATS, NIH. I think what was just said either is a good segue for my question, or maybe have already answered part of my question. So the question is this: investment at the end of the day is still the numbers, the returns, right? And 10 years ago, we heard about 7,000 diseases, 500 drugs, and today we're hearing 10,000 diseases, 500 drugs. So what has changed fundamentally? I think my question could specifically go to Dr. Schultz and everybody else on the panel as well. What have you done so differently that's a game changer, that all of a sudden investing in life science is financially attractive?
You know, I think we're a little bit agnostic on the return, other than that we want to use it to fund basic research, and we want to make new drugs and make the investors, you know, feel good about their investment and the opportunity to recap their investment and invest elsewhere. I think the getting early stage drug discovery and even up to phase 1 drug discovery into, you know, the world of academic science is a good thing, because academic science takes a very different perspective on how to do things than pharma. They have a very different risk-reward profile, and they actually, in general, tend to do things more efficiently, okay? So I think as you move all of the earlier stage drug discovery activities into that setting, and you make it feasible with the new technologies that reduce costs and allow you to do a lot more experimentation, that you're really going to be able to capture a lot of brain power from, you know, universities and research centers that historically you didn't until they were employees of the pharmaceutical companies, okay? So I think there's a huge opportunity now for academic institutions to have a huge impact. I mean, they've had a huge impact on science, all of science, for the last 50 years. The rate at which discoveries have been made has been incredible. And if you take that same brain power now and start to enable earlier stage drug discovery all the way to the clinic, and you create the infrastructure and provide the expertise to do it, I think it's an endless opportunity.
Unfortunately, I think that's all of our time, but I want to thank all of our panelists and thank all of you, and keep doing big things.